The first sound I ever hated wasn't thunder or gunfire. It was laughter. Not the kind that warms a room, but the kind that scrapes against bone. The kind that reminds you that no matter how far you've come, some people will always hear where you started. That morning, in a bright lecture hall that smelled of chalk and ambition, their laughter rose around me like a storm. Each echo stripped something from me: my courage, my pride, my mother's faith that my voice was a gift. And by the time it stopped, I had already decided that silence would hurt less than being heard. I had arrived in the city with pockets almost empty, but a heart full of purpose. The university stood like a cathedral of promise, glass and steel gleaming under the sun, so different from the cracked clay walls of the village school where I had first dreamed of becoming a broadcaster. My mother's hands had been rough from the fields when she touched my cheek that morning of departure and whispered, "Speak proudly, my son. Your father's voice still lives in you." I carried that blessing like armor. I didn't know how easily armor can turn to weight. The classroom pulsed with confidence. Students leaned back in their chairs, laughing in the language of the city, smooth, quick, mercilessly fluent. I sat near the door, clutching my notebook, pretending to study the timetable while secretly rehearsing my name. When the professor called for introductions, I prayed the bell would ring, that some small accident might spare me. It didn't. My turn came like a sentence. I stood. The floor felt alive beneath my shoes. I could feel my heart beating in my fingertips as I spoke. Just my name, my home, the dream that had carried me there. But the sound of my own voice betrayed me. The vowels stretched too long. The consonants landed too hard, every syllable carrying dust and distance. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then the first chuckle broke the stillness, and the room followed. It started near the back, a burst of disbelief, then another, until the laughter swelled and bounced off the tiled walls. Someone mimicked my words under his breath. Another clapped sarcastically. Even the professor's smile folded into something that wasn't kindness. I tried to laugh with them, to disguise the tremor in my chest, but the sound came out hollow and strange, like a cracked bell. I sat down before the shaking in my legs gave me away. The rest of the class blurred. I remember only the sound, their laughter weaving itself into the whir of the ceiling fan, the scrape of chairs, the creak of my pen as I pressed it too hard against the page. By the time the lecture ended, I had made a promise to myself. I would never let them hear that sound again. I would bury my accent, reshape my tongue, build a new voice from silence if I had to. That night, I stood before the mirror in the small hostel room that smelled of soap and loneliness. I repeated my name over and over, carving it into shapes that didn't belong to me. The city's accent felt like glass in my mouth, cold, fragile, cutting, but I forced myself to keep practicing until the voice staring back sounded almost acceptable. When I finally stopped, my throat ached, my eyes burned, and the boy in the mirror looked like a stranger wearing my skin. Days became weeks. I learned to speak less, to smile more, to let others fill the spaces my silence left behind. During presentations, I offered to run the projector instead of reading aloud. In group discussions, I nodded as if agreement could hide insecurity. My grades remained perfect, my presence forgettable. Silence became my disguise, and invisibility my safety. Yet every night, when the campus lights dimmed and the world quieted, I whispered to myself in my mother's tongue, just to remember what home sounded like. The sound was soft, fragile, forbidden, like a secret prayer. There is a loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being unheard. I carried that loneliness through corridors and cafeterias, through semesters and sleepless nights. Sometimes I caught my reflection in a window and didn't recognize the man who looked back, someone polished, educated, voiceless. My mother wrote letters asking if I spoke on stage yet, if the professors praised my diction. I told her yes. I lied, so she wouldn't hear the silence that had become my life. Shame is a quiet teacher. It taught me how to disappear without leaving. It taught me that the body can survive humiliation, but the soul remembers the sound forever. I thought I could outgrow it, that success might drown it out. But memory has a cruel habit of echoing at the worst times, and mine always echoed with laughter. I believed I had buried my voice so deep it would never rise again. But voices, like roots, find cracks in the earth. And one night when the world least expected it, mine began to push its way back toward the light, louder, stronger, and unwilling to stay silent any longer. There's a kind of silence that doesn't bring peace. It brings confrontation. It's the kind that traps you with yourself, the kind where even your heartbeat feels too loud to bear. I thought I could run from the laughter by running from my voice. But the cruel truth is this: you can leave your village, you can bury your accent, but you cannot escape the sound of your own soul. It follows you like a shadow that knows your name, whispering reminders in every reflection you try not to look at. Nights became my prison. The dormitory, quiet and dark, would fill with ghosts of voices that weren't mine. I bought a second-hand recorder, a battered piece of metal with chipped buttons and a faint smell of burnt plastic. I told myself it would save me, that if I could learn to sound like them, smooth, effortless, city-born, then maybe I'd finally belong. So I began the ritual. Every night, when the hallway lights dimmed and laughter faded into dreams, I would sit on the edge of my bed and press record. The tiny red light blinked like a heartbeat as I spoke. Paragraphs from newspapers, lines from radio hosts, speeches from men who commanded rooms with their voices. I tried to mimic them all, but each time I pressed play, something inside me broke a little more, because the voice that came back was mine. But not mine. It was hollow, metallic, strangled by shame. It no longer carried the warmth of soil and rain, the rhythm of the language my mother sang to me as a child. It was trying too hard to belong, and in trying, it had become lifeless. I would listen, over and over, until disgust crept up my spine like cold water. Then I would delete the recording and start again, whispering to the dark. Once more, until I disappear. Right. But no matter how many times I practiced, the boy from the village still clung to my tongue, like a ghost that refused to die. Days were worse. My roommate, sharp suit, perfect accent, easy smile, noticed my late-night whispering. One evening he burst into the room just as I was reading aloud. He laughed, not cruelly at first, but with that amused surprise of someone who has found a private joke. "You sound like a radio breaking down," he chuckled, and I froze. The laughter echoed in my bones like thunder remembering where to strike. I smiled weakly, pretended it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered more than I could admit. By the next night, he had turned it into entertainment, an imitation performed for others in the dorm. They laughed, too, not knowing each laugh was a nail sealing the coffin of the person I used to be. I stopped practicing. I stopped speaking. I convinced myself that silence was safer, that invisibility was better than ridicule. Letters from home arrived every few weeks, written in my mother's looping script. She always ended the same way. "Your voice is your father's legacy. Don't lose it trying to fit in." I used to read those words and feel warmth. Now they felt like an accusation. I hid them under my mattress, afraid of the guilt they carried. Because I wasn't just losing my voice, I was killing it, piece by piece, with every word I refused to speak. There were days when I forgot what I even sounded like. My voice had become a memory, a fading photograph. I had built my own silence and moved inside it, convincing myself that this was survival, until the day the mirror betrayed me. It was late afternoon. Rain whispered against the window. I had just returned from class, drenched and exhausted, and stood before the cracked mirror nailed to the dorm wall. For the first time in months, I whispered my name. It came out broken, half forgotten, I whispered it again, louder. The face that looked back at me wasn't mine. It was thinner, duller, eyes hollow, lips trembling. I didn't recognize the person staring at me. It was as if the reflection itself pitied me. The more I spoke, the stranger I sounded. I could no longer hear my father in my tone, my mother in my rhythm, my village in my breath. The mirror didn't just show me my face, it showed me what I had become, a man trying to erase his own roots. I pressed my palm against the glass, watching my reflection ripple in the light. The silence in that small room was deafening. I don't know what came over me then. Maybe anger, maybe grief, maybe both. I snatched the recorder from the drawer and threw it across the room. It hit the wall and fell apart, spilling batteries and shame across the floor. The echo of that crash filled the room, sharp and final. For the first time in months, I cried, not from pain, but from the realization that I had been laughing along with those who had destroyed me. I thought breaking the recorder would free me, but it didn't. It just left me alone with a mirror that wouldn't stop showing me the truth. A week later, in the library, I heard it. A voice that stopped my heart mid-beat. It was heavy, trembling, thick with the same accent I had once buried. A stranger stood before a shelf, reading aloud without shame, his tone defiant, his eyes unafraid. In that moment, it felt as if my reflection had stepped out of the mirror and learned how to speak again. I didn't know it yet, but that stranger, the one whose voice carried the same music as mine, was about to remind me who I really was. Sometimes the voice of a stranger sounds more familiar than your own. It slips through the noise of your life like a thread of memory, wrapping itself around your ribs until you remember what it felt like to belong. I had spent so long running from the sound of where I came from that when it finally found me again, I didn't recognize it at first. It came not from a stage or a classroom, but from a mop and a song echoing down an empty corridor. It happened late one evening, long after the lectures had ended and the campus had emptied into silence. The rain outside was steady, soft, the kind that makes the world sound far away. I was walking toward the library when I heard it, a voice humming faintly beneath the drone of fluorescent lights. It rose and fell with a rhythm I hadn't heard since childhood, a melody that carried dust and sunlight, riverbanks and firewood smoke. The sound came from the janitor, an older man in a faded uniform, sweeping the hallway with slow, deliberate movements. His bucket squeaked as it rolled beside him, but his voice was steady, alive. He sang in my language, not the polished one we learn in schools, but the real one, the one that bends and breathes like the wind through tall grass. For a long moment, I just stood there, unable to move. It was as if time had bent backward. My mother's songs, my father's laughter, the crackle of the radio in our village, they all lived in that one trembling tune. When he noticed me watching, he stopped mid-verse, his eyes crinkling in surprise. "Ah," he said, smiling. "You understand?" I nodded. My throat felt tight, as if the air itself had grown heavier. "Yes," I managed. "It's my language, too." He leaned on his mop and chuckled softly. "Then why do you look like you're hearing it for the first time?" His words hit harder than he knew. I didn't answer. I wanted to tell him that I had buried this language under years of fear, that I had traded it for accents that didn't belong to me. But shame is a stubborn ghost. It silences even confessions meant for kindness. He studied me for a moment, as though reading every unsaid thing. Then he said, "You sound like someone who's been told his roots are dirt." The truth of it stung. I looked down at the floor, at the reflection of the lights in the wet tiles. "People laugh," I said quietly. "When I speak like that, they think it sounds uneducated." The janitor's smile didn't falter. He set the mop aside, straightened his back, and looked at me, not like a servant to a student, but like a teacher to a lost child. "Child," he said slowly, "if your roots scare people, It's only because they've forgotten their own. The hallway fell silent, except for the hum of the lights and the sound of rain pressing against the windows. I wanted to speak, to argue, to explain, but I couldn't. My throat burned. His words hung in the air like incense, seeping into every corner of my doubt. He picked up the bucket again and started to walk away, still humming the same old tune. But before turning the corner, he said over his shoulder, "Your voice is home for someone. Don't board up the door just because others are afraid to knock." That night, I couldn't sleep. His words echoed inside me like an unfinished song. I kept hearing that melody, soft but relentless, winding through my thoughts until I gave up trying to silence it. I reached for my old recorder, the same one I had thrown against the wall weeks ago. I had repaired it, though the cracks still showed, much like me. For the first time in months, I didn't try to sound perfect. I didn't mimic anyone. I didn't flatten my tone or bury the rhythm of where I came from. I simply spoke. And then I recited one of my father's old poems, the one about rain coming home to the earth that raised it. My hands trembled, my voice cracked, but I kept going. When I finished, I hit play. The voice that came back wasn't flawless. It was thick, raw, trembling, but alive. Every syllable carried dust and blood and memory. It sounded like my father. It sounded like my village. It sounded like me. For the first time, I didn't flinch. I didn't cringe. I closed my eyes and listened as if hearing myself for the very first time. The shame that had once clung to my tongue began to melt, replaced by something warmer, something ancient and familiar. It wasn't pride, not yet, but it was awakening. I played it again, and again. Each replay felt like digging up something sacred I had buried long ago. I remembered my mother's hands stirring porridge as she hummed this same rhythm, my father's laughter rumbling in the courtyard, the sound of children chasing goats through dust, all the small symphonies of belonging that no city could ever imitate. When dawn finally came, the light spilled across my desk and onto the recorder. I pressed stop, then rewind, then played once more, just to be sure it wasn't a dream. But it wasn't. It was my voice, my father's son. I returned home. I didn't know then that this small, trembling recording, born in a dark dorm room with rain outside and courage barely rekindled, would one day escape my hands. It would travel beyond walls and borders, played by ears I'd never meet. And the same world that once mocked the sound of my voice would one day stop to listen. They say pain makes you stronger, but sometimes it just teaches you new ways to bleed. I thought I was ready to be heard, ready to let the world meet the voice I had finally made peace with. What I didn't realize was that redemption doesn't come without repetition. Sometimes life brings you back to the same fire, just to see if you'll burn the same way again. The day I joined the university radio team, the air smelled of dust and electricity. The studio was small, filled with wires that hummed faintly and microphones that glowed like watchful eyes. To everyone else, it was just another extracurricular activity. To me, it was war, me against the ghosts of laughter that still echoed in the corners of my memory. When the station manager handed me a script, my hands trembled slightly. It was nothing fancy, just an introduction for the afternoon segment on student life. But the words felt heavy. Every syllable carried the weight of all the times I'd been told my voice didn't belong. I took a deep breath, pressed the headset against my ears, and waited for the red light to turn on. When it did, something inside me steadied. "Good afternoon, listeners," I began, my voice low but sure. "This is Daniel from the student radio, bringing you stories from around campus." For a few shining minutes, everything was perfect. The words flowed naturally, the rhythm right, the air between sentences alive. The control room gave me a thumbs up, and even the manager smiled faintly. I thought, finally. Finally, the world would hear me, as I was meant to be heard. Then the phone line blinked. A call had come in for the live segment. Listeners could comment or ask questions. I picked it up, still riding the high of confidence. "Hello," I said brightly. "You're live on campus radio." Static crackled, and then laughter. Not the kind that warms, but the kind that slices. "Hey, radio boy," a voice sneered. "Say that again, but slower. Can't understand your farmer tongue." Another joined in, mimicking my accent in exaggerated tones. The others in the background howled. The laughter hit me like a slap. It poured through my headset, spilling into the studio, echoing across the speakers that reached every hallway, every dorm, every classroom tuned in. I froze, staring at the microphone as if it had turned into a snake. The soundboard lights flickered, and my silence filled the space where my words should have been. For a few seconds, the only sound was the laughter, then static. Someone in the control room panicked and cut the feed. The broadcast went dead. I took off my headset slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. My tongue felt too heavy to move, my throat too tight to swallow. The station manager avoided my eyes as he leaned toward the console and muttered, "You have a nice voice, but maybe not for radio. Maybe not for radio." The words sank like stones into water. I nodded, pretending they didn't hurt, pretending I didn't see the pity on his face or the awkward shuffling of the others in the booth. I left before anyone could stop me. Outside, the campus was alive with laughter again. But now it was real, not imagined. Someone had recorded the prank. It spread like wildfire across group chats, captioned with mockery. "Local boy goes live, then dies on air." By nightfall, I couldn't bear to open my phone. My throat ached, not from talking, but from holding back everything I wanted to scream. I walked until my legs gave out, ending up by the edge of the old football field. The floodlights flickered faintly, the bleachers empty, the world quiet except for the rain starting to fall again. Always the rain, returning to witness my humiliation. I sat there for hours, soaked and shaking, replaying the broadcast in my head. Every pause, every stutter, every cruel echo. The confidence I had built piece by piece cracked open like glass under a hammer. I thought of quitting school, of vanishing back into the silence where no one could laugh anymore. And yet, somewhere in that despair, another sound emerged. The janitor's voice, his words replayed, steady and patient. "If your roots scare people, it's because they've forgotten their own." I whispered the line to myself again and again until it became a shield. The laughter still stung, but it no longer felt final. It felt familiar, like an old test life was forcing me to take again, to see if this time I'd choose differently. I went back to my dorm, drenched and exhausted. My phone screen glowed with notifications. I braced myself for more ridicule, but among the flood of mockery, there was one message, quiet, buried deep in the noise. It was from an unknown address. I opened it. The message was only one sentence long. "I don't know who you are," it read, "but your voice sounds like home." For a long time I stared at that message, unable to breathe. My heart pounded, not from shame now, but from something fragile and alive. Hope. I didn't know who that listener was, but their words reached into the ashes of my defeat and lit a spark I thought had died forever. I didn't know it then, but that single message, the voice that believed in mine, was about to change the course of everything that came after. Fame never knocks politely. It crashes through the door of the life you thought you understood. When that email arrived, I didn't see opportunity. I saw danger. I had spent years building peace out of quiet, and suddenly the world wanted to turn my silence into a stage. I thought I was ready to be heard again, but I was wrong. Being heard is easy. Being understood is the real battle. I read the message again and again, half convinced it was a scam. "Your voice carries something ancient," the producer had written. "Meet me." There was a studio address at the edge of the city, a time, and nothing else. For 3 days, I didn't reply. Every doubt I'd ever buried came crawling back. What if this was another cruel joke? What if this time the laughter came from people with microphones and cameras instead of classmates? But curiosity, hope's reckless twin, won. On the fourth morning, I took the old bus into the city's heart. My hand sweated against the folded paper with the address scribbled on it. When I finally reached the building, I hesitated outside. The glass doors reflected a version of me I barely recognized, nervous, thin, carrying a recorder in one hand like a relic. Inside, the lobby smelled of coffee and metal. Music thumped faintly from somewhere above, the kind that vibrates through your ribs rather than your ears. A receptionist led me down a hallway to a room padded with black foam walls. And there he was, the producer. He was younger than I expected, mid-30s maybe, wearing headphones around his neck and eyes that looked permanently tired from chasing sound. "You're the storyteller," he said simply. "Sit." He asked me to speak. Anything. I froze, the same way I had in that first classroom years ago. But then I remembered the old woman's words. "Your voice sounds like home," and I began. I told the story of how my father used to teach me rhythm by drumming on a water pot, how my mother's songs could make even the rain wait at the door. He didn't interrupt. He closed his eyes and listened, nodding softly as if my words were music. When I stopped, the room felt different, thicker somehow, charged. Finally he said, "That's it. That's what I've been looking for. Not polish, pulse." He explained that he wanted to create a project, a fusion of storytelling and sound design, something raw and intimate that captured the emotion of the human voice, stripped of performance. "Your tone," he said, "is not an accent. It's a map." I didn't fully understand what he meant then, but the conviction in his voice was enough. Within a week, I was in a recording booth for the first time in my life. The walls swallowed every echo. A microphone hung before me like a question I had waited years to answer. The producer gestured through the glass. "Just tell me something. True." So I did. I told him about the laughter, the silence, the janitor, the message that saved me. I told him about the boy who hated his own reflection until a stranger's song made him remember. The red light blinked on, steady as a heartbeat, and I began to speak the way my ancestors must have, slow, rhythmic, full of earth. When I finished, there was no applause, no sound at all, just the producer's quiet whisper through the intercom. "That's not a take, that's testimony." Days turned into nights in that studio. He layered my words over soft percussion, faint strings, whispers of wind recorded from open fields. The first time I heard it played back, I didn't recognize myself. It sounded larger. My voice wasn't just mine anymore. It carried the weight of everyone who had ever been told they spoke wrong, everyone who had swallowed their truth to fit in. Then, the project went live. No fanfare, no marketing. Just a single upload labeled "The Voice of Dust and Light." Within a week, it spread. Emails poured in from places I couldn't even find on a map. People wrote about listening in the dark, about crying without knowing why. Teachers played it in classrooms. A radio station picked it up. The irony was cruel and perfect. After being told my voice wasn't made for radio, it was now everywhere. The producer called one evening, his voice thick with disbelief. "You don't understand," he said. "They're calling you the storyteller of the forgotten." I laughed through tears. All I had done was speak the way I was born to. But success, I would soon learn, has its own kind of silence, the one that waits beneath applause. As my voice reached strangers across oceans, I began to feel another storm rising inside me, one I couldn't name yet. The same voice that had set me free was about to demand something far greater. The truth I still hadn't told. They wanted my words, but not my truth. The same people who had called my voice authentic when it served their stories now called it unmarketable when it threatened to stand on its own. I had spent a lifetime fighting to be heard, and just when I thought I had finally won, I realized the world had only turned up the volume so it could rewrite the lyrics. The producer's office was quiet when he said it. Too quiet. "Your emotion is perfect," he began, his tone soft and rehearsed, the kind of calm that hides a blade beneath a compliment. "But the accent, if we could just smooth it out, make it a little cleaner, it would reach more people." My chest went cold. Those words, I had heard them all my life, in classrooms, in markets, in every conversation that made me feel smaller than the person speaking. Neutralize it. That's what they meant. Erase the sound of my soil, my rain, my ancestors. Translate my truth into something the world could swallow without choking on its difference. I looked at him across the table. The glossy posters on his wall stared down at me. Faces of other artists, polished, perfect, silent in their obedience. He smiled, mistaking my stillness for agreement. "It's just business," he added lightly. "You can keep the heart, just change the wrapping." Change the wrapping. The pen trembled in my hand. For a moment, I could almost hear the laughter from the university hallways, echoing through time, blending with his voice. I could see the reflection of that frightened boy in the dorm mirror, the one who tried to erase himself to belong. I had buried that version of me long ago, but now here he was, staring back from the edge of this moment, whispering, "Don't do it again." I swallowed hard. "You said my voice was the reason you reached out," I said quietly. "It is," he replied, too quickly. "But the industry is different. You have to adapt." Adapt. Another word that means bend until you break. He pushed the contract toward me, the paper heavy with invisible weight. "Sign it," he said. "This album will change your life. Change my life. But what good is a changed life if it no longer sounds like you?" The pen hovered above the line. My fingers ached. The silence stretched so long that even the air seemed to wait for my betrayal. And then, through that silence, another voice rose, the one that had carried me through every storm, my father's. He used to tell me, "A voice is not just sound, it's memory. Lose your voice, and you lose your story." I had spent years trying to forget his lessons, but they had been waiting patiently in the corners of my heart, ready to return when I needed them most. I set the pen down, slowly, deliberately. "I can't change it," I said. "Not this time." His smile faltered. "Think about what you're walking away from," he warned. "Millions of ears, awards, global reach." I stood up. "If I erase myself to reach them, what will they actually be hearing?" He leaned back, exhaling, the disappointment thick enough to taste. "You're making a mistake." Maybe I was. But it felt like the first honest mistake I'd made in years. I walked out of that glass room with nothing but my truth. Outside, the city hummed its indifferent rhythm. Cars, chatter, rain tapping against the pavement. The noise felt alive, real, unedited. I breathed it in like air after suffocation. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the torn halves of the contract on my desk like wounded paper wings. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. I just stared at them, thinking about how easily I could have signed, how simple it would have been to trade authenticity for applause. Instead, I reached for the old box beneath my bed, the one filled with tapes of my father's voice. The cassettes were worn, their labels faded, but his laughter was still there, raw and alive. I pressed play and closed my eyes, the room filled with his sound, unpolished, real, alive with the music of imperfection. He laughed, between sentences, mispronounced words, and sang off-key. But to me, it was a symphony. It was the reminder that truth doesn't need permission to be beautiful. I sat there in the dark, letting his voice braid itself through mine, until I realized something simple and terrifying. I didn't need their world to exist. I could build my own. I took one of the broken contracts and wrote across it in bold ink, "They can own the stage. I'll own the echo." By dawn, I had already made my decision. If the world didn't want my voice, then I would create a world that did. I didn't know what it would look like yet, but somewhere in that promise, I could already hear it rising. The same voice they tried to erase was about to become unstoppable. When no one gives you a platform, build your own stage. The truth is, the world doesn't silence you. It just waits to see if you'll silence yourself. I had walked away from the spotlight. They tried to sell me, but I wasn't done speaking. I didn't need permission anymore. I needed purpose. And sometimes all it takes to start a revolution is a cracked laptop, an old microphone, and a voice that refuses to die quietly. The first video I uploaded didn't even have a title screen. The lighting was bad, the audio fuzzy, and the background was a simple cloth I'd nailed against the wall to hide the peeling paint. But when I pressed record, my heartbeat steadied like a drum, and for the first time in years, I spoke into the silence without fear of what it might give back. It was a story my grandmother used to tell, a tale of a woman who caught the wind in a calabash and learned that freedom is not about flight, but about the courage to open what you've trapped. I spoke it slowly, in my native accent, savoring every vowel, every rhythm. When I finished and clicked upload, I didn't expect anything. No one starts a fire expecting the whole forest to glow. By morning, the video had a few dozen views, mostly strangers, but the comments, they made me sit up straighter. This reminds me of my childhood nights. Your accent is beautiful. Don't ever lose it. I played this for my kids. They said it sounds like their grandma. Each comment felt like a lifeline thrown across the oceans. People weren't just listening, they were remembering. What I thought was small had become something sacred. I wasn't just telling stories, I was preserving memory. So I kept recording. Every night after work, I'd sit in that tiny room, plug in the same old microphone that wheezed like it was tired of breathing, and pour my soul into stories. Folk tales about trickster hares, river spirits, kings who ruled with kindness. I didn't edit out my pauses or my stumbles. I left the humanity in. That became the heartbeat of my channel. Slowly, the audience grew. First hundreds, then thousands. By the end of the second month, there were viewers from countries I'd only seen in textbooks: Africa, Asia, Europe. People from places with their own buried accents, their own histories of being told to speak differently, wrote to say that my voice made them feel less alone. They called me the keeper of voices. And maybe that's what I had become. Not a broadcaster chasing perfection, but a bridge between generations. Every story I told felt like planting something that might outlive me. My grandmother's songs, my father's laughter, my mother's prayers, they all lived in the spaces between my words. Soon I didn't just record folk stories. I began to read letters from listeners, stories of migration, of losing language, of learning to love it again. My channel turned into a community where accents weren't corrected, they were celebrated. The comment section became a global campfire. What I didn't realize then was how powerful the hunger for authenticity had become in a world full of polished lies. My rawness was my rebellion. When interviewers from online magazines reached out, asking about my inspiration, I laughed and said, rejection. Because that's what it had all been born from, the kind of pain that either silences you or makes you louder than you've ever been. Before long, companies reached out for collaborations, schools requested to use my recordings in cultural programs, and strangers began sending me folk stories from their regions, asking me to narrate them. My accent, the same sound once mocked in lecture halls, was now a trademark. I didn't just own it, I protected it. I would wake up to emails from teachers in Kenya, mothers in India, grandparents in Ghana, all saying the same thing. Your stories make us feel seen, and maybe that's the greatest gift a voice can give, to make others remember who they are. Then one morning, as I was preparing my next upload, a message popped into my inbox. The subject line read, Partnership Inquiry, Global Broadcast Opportunity. I almost ignored it, assuming it was spam. But then I noticed the sender's address. It was from one of the world's largest broadcasting networks, the kind whose name I had grown up hearing on my father's radio. My breath caught. I clicked it open. The message was brief, professional, and world-shaking. We've been following your work. We believe your voice has global resonance. We'd like to feature your storytelling series across our international platforms. Let's talk distribution. Your voice deserves to be heard worldwide. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it echo in the walls. The same voice they once told me to erase was now being offered to the entire world. I leaned back in my chair, trembling between disbelief and destiny. Every memory, the laughter, the silence, the broken contracts, rushed through me like wind before a storm. I had built a stage from scraps, and now the world was standing at its door, asking to come in. But deep down, I knew one truth. Global attention comes with a price, and the real question wasn't whether the world would hear me. It was whether it would still let me stay myself. There was a time when the sound of my own voice made my hands tremble, when every word I spoke felt like a sin against the world's idea of perfection. But that day, under the blinding lights of an auditorium packed with faces from every corner of the world, the same voice that once cracked with shame now filled the air with silence so profound, even the doubters forgot how to breathe. The invitation arrived with a red logo at the top and a single line that made my heart stop. We would be honored to have you speak at TED on the theme, The Power of Voice. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. The irony almost made me laugh. A boy who once promised himself never to speak again was now being asked to teach the world about the power of speech. In the weeks that followed, I prepared like a man walking toward both a dream and a ghost. I wrote my talk by candlelight, every word pulled from years of humiliation and healing. I rehearsed in front of the mirror, not to polish my accent, but to make peace with it. Each sentence I practiced carried echoes of the laughter I'd once endured, but this time, those echoes didn't haunt me. They fueled me. When the day arrived, the auditorium was a sea of anticipation. Cameras, lights, screens. Everything gleamed with the quiet promise of history in the making. The red TED circle lay in the center of the stage, glowing like a wound that had finally learned to heal. My hands were trembling again, but this time, not from fear, from awe. As I walked toward the microphone, the crowd fell still. And then, in the front row, I saw him, my old university professor, the same man whose polite smile had masked pity when my classmates mocked my voice. His eyes met mine, a flicker of recognition passing between us. For a split second, I was back in that classroom, small, ashamed, voiceless. But then the lights hit my face, and the present swallowed the past whole. I took a deep breath, leaned toward the mic, and began. My name, I said, my accent thick and proud, is the same one you once laughed at. And this, I touched my throat lightly, is the voice that survived your silence. A ripple went through the audience. Soft gasps, shifting seats, a collective intake of breath. I continued, telling my story not as a victim, but as a witness. I spoke of the boy who stopped talking, the man who rebuilt himself word by word, and the truth that no voice deserves translation to be understood. Halfway through, as I recited one of my father's lines, the sound of your roots will always find its way back to the wind. The audience rose in spontaneous applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was thunder. 1,000 hands striking together in rhythm, breaking every chain that had ever held me down. I paused, let the noise wash over me, and smiled. Not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but for the little boy who had once stood in a classroom, wishing for this very sound, not laughter, but belonging. When it ended, the crowd stood for a long time. Reporters rushed backstage, microphones in hand. Words like revolutionary, authentic, and unforgettable filled the air. By morning, my talk had gone viral. The headlines read, "The voice that spoke for the voiceless." Messages flooded in. Students, teachers, artists, even politicians, saying how the talk had changed them. I read one comment that said, "He didn't just speak. He healed something inside us we didn't know was broken." For the first time, I realized my voice was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. Interviews followed. Invitations came from across continents. My channel exploded with new listeners. My email filled with offers. My calendar booked months in advance. It felt like the world had finally opened its arms and said, "We hear you now." But beneath the applause, there was something else, something quieter. A faint hum in the back of my mind, a whisper that sounded like home. I ignored it at first. Success is a kind of noise, and it can drown out even the most sacred calls. Weeks later, that whisper turned into a phone call. It came just as I was leaving another studio interview. The city outside was glittering, alive, the world finally mine. I answered without looking at the caller ID, still smiling from the rush of lights and applause. But the moment I heard the voice on the other end, the world around me seemed to tilt. The voice was trembling, familiar, broken. Something had happened, something that would drag me from the center of the world stage back to the very ground that had first shaped my voice. The lights of the auditorium still burned in my mind as the words echoed through the phone. Tragedy had found its way home. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, the city roaring around me, realizing that while my voice had finally reached the world, the one place it was needed most was slipping away. Even when the world finally hears you, silence can still break your heart. I had spent years trying to give my voice to the world, but no one told me that in doing so, I might lose the one person who had given it to me in the first place. It was late evening when the call came, the kind of call that doesn't need words to destroy you. The voice on the other end trembled as it spoke my name. I could hear the wind from my village crackling through the line, that familiar emptiness between breaths that told me what I didn't want to know. "Your mother," the caller whispered. "She's gone." For a few seconds, I forgot how to breathe. The city noise outside my apartment blurred into a single, long hum, like the world had lost all definition. My fingers went numb around the phone. I managed only one question, though my voice barely found its way out. "How?" The answer came like a blade wrapped in cotton. "She was listening to your voice when it happened. The radio was still on. The radio was still on." Those words kept echoing long after the call ended. She had died listening to me, her son, the boy who once buried his voice in shame. Somewhere between one sentence and the next, she had slipped quietly out of the world, carried away on the rhythm of my story. I fell to the floor, the phone clattering beside me. The air felt too heavy to breathe, too sharp to swallow. I had spent my life chasing recognition, chasing validation, but in that moment, every award, every standing ovation, every headline meant nothing. The one person I had wanted to make proud had left while I was still speaking to strangers. For hours, I sat there, replaying the last message she had ever sent me months before. "I listen to you every night, my son. Your father would be proud." Her words had been simple, but now they burned through me with unbearable truth. She had waited her whole life to hear me be proud of who I was, and she had finally found peace in the sound of my voice. I returned home 3 days later. The village had changed, yet somehow it hadn't. The same dirt roads, the same trees bending under the wind. Only the faces had grown older. When I walked into the yard, people stood quietly, eyes full of both pride and pity. My mother's small radio still sat on the table, its dial frozen mid-frequency, as if even it couldn't bear to move on. At the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to speak. My throat refused to open, my voice trembling somewhere between grief and guilt. But the villagers, they did something I will never forget. Instead of hymns, they played my recordings. One of the men set the radio near her casket, and my voice began to fill the air. Steady, calm, telling the story of the woman who spoke to the wind. I remembered recording that 1 year ago, my accent thick, my breath uneven. Now it echoed through the hills that had once mocked me. The same hills where I had once hidden from laughter were now carrying my voice like a prayer. People closed their eyes. Some wept quietly. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was hers too. The woman who taught me to speak before the world told me not to. The woman whose lullabies had shaped my tone, whose silences had taught me patience. When the story ended, I walked toward her grave, the radio still humming faintly beside it. My knees hit the earth before I could stop them. I pressed my hand against the freshly turned soil and whispered, "You heard me, Mama. You heard me before the world did." Tears ran down my face, but beneath the grief, there was something else, something fierce and unbreakable. I realized then that she hadn't died listening to my story. She had died inside it. She had become part of the voice itself. That night I stayed by her grave, long after everyone had gone. The stars hung low. The Oisao crickets sang, and somewhere far away, I could still hear the faint static of the radio. I picked it up and turned the dial, letting my own voice fade in and out between stations. It was then that I understood. Silence isn't the opposite of a voice. It's where it lives when love is gone. As dawn crept over the hills, I stood and made her a final promise. "I will never let our accent die," I whispered. "The world will remember where this voice was born." And as the sun rose behind the mountains, the wind carried my words away. Back toward the village, back toward the radio still playing softly, as if she were listening from somewhere beyond the static. I started speaking for her, but the world began to listen too. It's strange how a voice born in shame can grow into something sacred, how the sound you once wished to erase becomes the rhythm that binds people together. I thought I was recording stories to keep my mother's memory alive, but somewhere along the way, her spirit began to speak through me, and the world heard her. Months passed after her death, yet her presence never left my recordings. Each time I sat before the microphone, I imagined her sitting beside the radio again, nodding along, whispering small corrections like she used to. "Slow down," she'd say. "Let the words breathe." It began with one email from a teacher in South Africa. She wrote, "Your voice is now part of our classroom. My students listen to you every morning. They say your accent sounds like their grandparents." Then came another, from a curator in Ghana. "We want to include your stories in an exhibit about language and identity." Soon I was receiving messages from all over the world, schools, libraries, cultural centers, each one requesting permission to use my voice in lessons about diversity, empathy, and heritage. My accent, once called uneducated, had become a tool for education itself. I sat at my desk one evening, reading these messages aloud to the empty room, and felt tears roll down my face. For years, I had wanted to sound like everyone else. Now, people were learning, because I didn't. The foundation began almost by accident. A small NGO reached out, offering to help record the stories of underprivileged youth in their local communities. "We want them to find their voice the way you found yours," they said. I didn't have to think twice. I gave them my blessing, my equipment, and eventually, my name. We called it the Voice Project, a home for the unheard. Every week I'd receive new recordings from children across villages, cities, and refugee camps, some telling bedtime stories, some singing, some simply talking about their dreams. Their voices crackled through the speakers with the same raw courage I had once buried in myself. I made it my mission to mentor them, teaching them what my mother had taught me, that the sound of your truth is more powerful than the silence of your fear. And then came The moment that changed everything. A group of young volunteers from the foundation created a short film using my mother's favorite poem, the one she used to recite while cooking, her voice rising and falling like music. The river never asks permission to flow, it just goes home. They translated the poem into 12 languages and invited voices from around the world to recite it, each one different, each one beautiful. When the film premiered online, it spread like wildfire. Millions watched. Schools played it in assemblies. The poem that once lived only in my mother's kitchen had become an anthem for self-acceptance. News outlets called it the language of love. I watched that video 100 times, and every time, when my mother's line played in her original tongue, I closed my eyes. It sounded like the wind moving through the fields of our village, soft, unyielding, eternal. Soon, my name began to appear alongside phrases like global movement and cultural preservation. But I knew better. This was never about me. It was about the countless voices that had been silenced, the accents mocked, the languages left behind in classrooms that only praised one sound. I was simply the echo that refused to fade. I began traveling to speak at universities, not as a symbol of success, but as a reminder of resilience. In every auditorium, I'd play a recording of one of my foundation's students, a boy from a small town who'd once said, "When I record, I feel like I exist." That was what this journey had always been about, existence, not applause. One night, after a long tour, I returned to my apartment and played one of my oldest recordings, the very first story I had ever uploaded to YouTube. The audio was rough, my voice uncertain, the pauses awkward. I could almost hear the fear in my breathing, but instead of cringing, I smiled. Because that broken voice was brave. That was the sound of someone who refused to stay silent, even when the world said he should. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let it play to the end. When it finished, the room was silent except for the hum of the old laptop fan. I realized, with a strange kind of ache, that I had forgiven everyone who had ever laughed at me. Everyone except one person. The boy who had once been so ashamed of his own sound that he stopped speaking. I looked into the mirror, older now, voice steady, face calm, and whispered to my reflection, "It's time to forgive you too." But as I spoke, I felt something shift deep inside, the beginning of a silence, not born of fear, but of peace. For the first time, my voice trembled not from pain, but from release. And I knew the story wasn't ending. It was finally coming home. They once mocked my voice. Now it carries theirs across the world. The sound that was once my greatest shame has become a bridge between nations, a heartbeat that travels through microphones, wires, and wind. I used to believe my accent was too small for the world to hear. I never realized it was the world that needed to learn how to listen. Years later, I find myself standing under lights brighter than any I have ever seen, on a stage far from the red dust of my childhood. The screen behind me reads, Global Voices Summit, Celebrating Diversity Through Sound. Around me are young storytellers, singers, poets, dreamers, all of them carrying the same kind of music in their speech that once made me a target. As I step to the microphone, applause ripples across the hall. I wait for it to quiet, not out of pride, but reverence, because every clap feels like an echo of my mother's hands, clapping for me in her small kitchen, whispering, "Don't stop." My name, I begin, letting the weight of my accent rest proudly on every syllable, is still the same one they once laughed at. But today, it stands for everyone who has ever been told they sound wrong. The crowd listens in absolute stillness. I look into the sea of faces, different colors, cultures, generations, and I see in their eyes the reflection of my own younger self, the boy who once wished his mouth could sound like someone else's. Over the years, my recordings have found their way into classrooms, documentaries, museums, and film soundtracks. My mother's poem has been translated into 57 languages. Schoolchildren in countries I've never seen now recite her words every morning before class. My accent, once considered broken, has become a symbol of authenticity, a mark of pride, the sound of survival. But I never forgot why it mattered, because this was never about perfection. It was about belonging. And now, wherever I go, I tell young dreamers the same thing my janitor friend once told me years ago in that quiet university hallway. If your roots scare people, it's because they've forgotten their own. After every talk, I meet people who whisper their own stories to me in trembling voices. Immigrants afraid to speak at interviews, students laughed at for mispronouncing words, singers told to change their tone. Each one carries the same wound I once did. And to each, I say the same thing. Every voice matters, especially the ones they laugh at, because laughter fades, but truth echoes. One evening, after returning home from yet another event, I sat by my old desk, the same one where this all began. The microphone still stood there, scratched and dented, the same one I used for my very first recording. I ran my fingers across its surface, remembering every night I had spoken to it in fear, in hope, in grief. That night, I decided to record my final story, not for fame, not for the world, but for the boy I used to be. I clicked record, and my reflection stared back from the screen. Older now, lined with years, but steady. I took a breath, smiled faintly, and began. This is a letter to the boy who once hid behind silence, the one who thought his voice was too small, too strange, too wrong. Listen carefully, because I'm you, and I need you to know this. Speak, even when your voice shakes, because one day, it won't. My voice cracked halfway through, but I didn't stop. I kept going until the last word left my lips. When the recording ended, the room was silent again, but it wasn't empty. It felt full of echoes, of memories, of everything I'd ever lost and found through sound. Weeks later, that recording became part of a short film called The Voice That Crossed Oceans. It told my story, but more importantly, it told our story. The story of every child who has ever swallowed their words because the world taught them to be ashamed. The film spread like wildfire, screened at festivals, played in classrooms, shared by people who had never even heard of me, but somehow knew exactly what it meant to be unheard. Soon, the movement grew larger than the man who started it. The Voice Project became a global initiative, helping thousands of marginalized youth find platforms to share their own accents, dialects, and languages. Whenever I visited one of their studios, I would hear dozens of voices speaking in harmony, each one unique, each one proud. It was the most beautiful sound in the world, chaos made holy by honesty. And now, as I walk on stages across continents, I no longer introduce myself as the boy who was mocked. I introduce myself as the man who learned that the sound of difference is the sound of life itself. Everywhere I go, people ask me what success feels like, and I tell them the truth. It sounds like my mother's radio, still humming through the hills, my father's laughter somewhere in the wind, and my own voice whispering through time. You made it. You didn't change. You just grew louder. Today, when I open my mouth, I no longer hear laughter. I hear the echo of a world learning to listen. Somewhere, across oceans, a child presses play on one of my old stories, hearing not just me, but themselves. And in that moment, I know my journey was never about finding a voice. It was about giving the world permission to keep theirs. If this story touched your heart, don't let it fade into silence. Share it with someone who's ever been afraid to speak in their own voice. Tell me in the comments, what does your voice sound like when it's finally free? Subscribe now, because every week I bring you real stories that remind us the world listens when we dare to be ourselves.